Many people believe Atlantis began as a philosophical metaphor from the ancient Greek writer Plato, but in this fictional historical retelling, we will imagine that it was a real civilization, hidden beneath time, memory, and the oceans of the world, rising and collapsing long before the pyramids were built, before Stonehenge, and before human beings even understood what civilization meant. The story begins with a sailor named Corin, whose ship was caught in a violent storm off the coast of what is now called the Azores. He claimed to have seen lights beneath the water, a glowing grid of shapes that seemed too perfect to be natural, and when he returned to his village, no one believed him, but that sight would haunt him for the rest of his life. The truth of Atlantis in this telling is far older than Egypt, older than Sumer, older even than recorded myth, because according to our imagined chronicles, the Atlanteans were the first to understand how tides, stars, minerals, and human perception could align to create something resembling modern science. This story follows several characters whose lives intersect across centuries through lost tablets, hidden archives, and fragments of oral history preserved by secretive keepers known as the Resonants, a group sworn to hide the knowledge of Atlantis until the world was ready to understand it. One of the earliest accounts in the tale describes an explorer named Isara, a priestess who wandered into a desert cave in North Africa while searching for salt deposits, and instead found walls carved with precise star maps. The carvings included constellations that would not be visible in the northern hemisphere for another 10,000 years, suggesting either advanced astronomical knowledge or something stranger entirely. She took rubbings of the engravings and carried them back to a coastal settlement, where shipwrights whispered of forgotten continents and cities swallowed by rising seas. Generations later, her descendants would become keepers of stories, claiming that the Atlanteans communicated through resonant frequencies, tones that could etch shapes into stone and affect human memory. This fictional history moves forward to the time of a monk named Dorian, who lived in Ireland in the 8th century and wrote in the margins of a religious manuscript about the drowned tower that sings in moonlight, a place sailors described far out to sea, where compasses spun wildly and water glowed faintly blue. He never found the tower, but he spent his life searching through ancient libraries, convinced some lineage of forgotten knowledge connected Celtic stone circles to far older structures beneath the Atlantic. The heart of the story centers on a woman named Mara, a university researcher in modern Boston, who stumbles across a shipment of artifacts discovered by deep-sea surveyors working off the Bahamas. Inside a rusted steel container, she finds a smooth slate tablet, etched with perfect geometric lines, parallel, curved, spiraling inward toward a crystalline center, unlike anything attributed to indigenous cultures of the region. When carbon tested, the slate appears impossibly old, far older than known human tool use, and although the results are inconclusive, they spark her obsession. According to rumors, the pieces were found near the so-called Bimini Road, a natural underwater rock formation widely explained by geologists, but long suspected by fringe researchers to be artificial. Mara begins to research suppressed maritime logs and classified sonar maps, uncovering patterns of symmetrical underwater anomalies stretching in a grid-like shape across thousands of miles of ocean floor. Meanwhile, fictional flashback chapters describe Atlantis itself at its peak, gleaming harbors constructed of some alloy resistant to erosion, libraries where scribes recorded not only history but emotional experiences, and laboratories where philosopher-engineers experimented with resonant sound to manipulate biological growth.
The Atlanteans in this fictional world were not utopian. Their society struggled with rigid class systems, ritual obligations, and debates over whether knowledge should be shared freely or guarded by an elite council called the Circle of Nine. The tension reached a breaking point when a group of dissidents attempted to reveal forbidden research dealing with climate cycles and possible catastrophic floods. When their warnings were ignored, a faction of engineers secretly built massive resonant chambers deep below the city to preserve memory in case of disaster. According to the fictional chronicle called The Blue Archive, the dissidents believed the seas would begin to rise rapidly within a single generation, triggered by shifts in polar ice and underground volcanic venting. Some scholars in the story argue the disaster was caused by a sudden planetary realignment, while others think it was the result of Atlantean experiments gone wrong. Whatever the cause, the cataclysm came so quickly that entire neighborhoods were swallowed overnight. In this retelling, a young archivist named Selu fought her way into the resonant chamber, carrying tablets filled with the history of her people, including accounts of early trade with the ancestors of the Egyptians, Olmecs, and Druids. She sealed herself inside as the city collapsed above, and though this part of the story is imagined, the resonant chamber becomes a crucial link thousands of years later. Back in the present, Mara and an oceanographer named James organize a covert expedition funded by a private foundation that believes there may be cave complexes beneath volcanic shelves in the Atlantic. On their first descent, their submersible touches down near what appears to be a smooth stone arch buried under coral. They detect unusual magnetic disturbances, and a faint hum seems to vibrate through the metal of the vessel, like something old is still active. When they bring samples to the surface, material analysis suggests crystalline structures unlike natural basalt, similar to engineered composites used in modern laser technology, though the conclusion is only speculative. News of the discovery leaks online, drawing skepticism, ridicule, and sudden interest from unnamed government agencies. Some characters in the story hint that certain institutions have been aware of submerged structures for decades, but suppress the information to avoid public panic or scientific embarrassment. Mara begins decoding symbols from the tablet and discovers patterns that correspond to ancient star positions, including Sirius, Orion's belt, and a mysterious dark star referenced in forbidden Tibetan manuscripts. The story moves across continents, linking South American megalithic ruins, forgotten folklore in West Africa, and Bronze Age maritime networks that may have carried fragments of Atlantean knowledge after the disaster. In the final act, Mara and James discover an underwater vault that resembles the resonant chambers described in the Blue Archive. When they activate a sequence of tones reproduced from the carved tablet, the chamber walls begin to emit low-frequency sound, causing the water itself to vibrate. Inside, they find a memory archive, not digital, not written, but stored through harmonic resonance, a technology beyond anything known today in this fictional universe. The information reveals that Atlantis was not a single kingdom, but part of a global maritime culture, one that rose and fell repeatedly as coastlines changed over tens of thousands of years. The Atlanteans believed history moved in cycles and tried to preserve warnings for future civilizations, hoping someone would listen. As the fictional story closes, Mara writes in her research journal that every culture on Earth carries a fragment of Atlantis, not in grand golden cities or mythical weapons, but in ancient questions, in curiosity, in the urge to map stars and understand tides. She wonders whether humanity will repeat Atlantis's mistakes, clinging to power instead of sharing knowledge. And she reminds us that sometimes the oldest ruins are not buried in sand or sea, but hidden in the things we choose not to see. And that truth, whether imagined or forgotten, is worth thinking about each time we look at a map of the ocean and realize how little we really know.
The water around the submersible moved like liquid glass, trembling with that mysterious hum as if something deep under the ocean were breathing slowly in its sleep, and Mara could not shake the feeling that they had stumbled onto something far beyond archaeology.
James tried to record the resonance with their onboard instruments, but the vibrations scrambled the readings, showing impossible spikes and sudden dead zones, as if the sound had no physical source at all. When they rose to the surface, storms were gathering around their ship, although the forecast had been clear an hour earlier, a coincidence that gnawed at them both. Back in Boston, Mara studied the etched tablet for entire nights without sleep, scribbling notes about recurring spiral shapes and odd geometric ratios that reminded her of ancient Greek harmonics and the way Pythagoras described the music of the spheres. The deeper she dug, the more she discovered obscure references in medieval sailor logs to singing stones on the ocean floor, and rumors of a drowned monastery near Madeira, where monks claimed they heard voices beneath the waves. James, meanwhile, pulled old naval chain of custody records for undocumented sonar scans, finding entire folders blacked out by agencies no one in his circles would name. He suspected geopolitical interests, deep-sea mineral claims, even missile testing ranges, yet everything pointed back to one recurring note: sites of unexplained acoustic disturbance precisely aligned with the grid patterns Mara had traced on her underwater anomaly maps. At one point, a retired engineer from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution called James quietly from an unlisted number and warned him, "Stop mapping the resonance nodes before someone else notices you're doing it." That voice stuck with James for weeks because the man never explained how he knew about their research.
The story shifts backward, moving us further into the fictional ancient past, a time when Atlantis was not a single shining capital, but a network of 10 coastal cities connected by sea bridges, each ruled by competing councils. The Circle of Nine sat at the center of power, a mysterious tribunal composed of philosophers, engineers, ritual historians, and one figure only ever recorded as the listener. The listener's duty was to spend nights in a subterranean hall beneath the great harbor, sitting in silence beside enormous stone pillars tuned to different frequencies. These pillars, some believed, could interpret changes in global currents, tectonic vibrations, even migrations of whales. Legends from the Blue Archive describe the listener as part scientist, part mystic, able to read the memory of water, a symbolic force that guided navigators across entire oceans long before charts existed. One listener, a woman named Elua, noticed long before anyone else that the tidal harmonics were shifting, an early sign of the catastrophic floods described in Part 1. Her warnings were ignored, and her name was erased from official histories. Only dissidents remembered her, and for centuries afterward, the Resonants, the underground keepers of Atlantean memory, honored her as the first whistleblower in human history. Fictional records claim that the Atlantis collapse was not a single event, but a series of engineered disasters, triggered by political sabotage when two rival councils tried to seize control of the resonant laboratories. A scientist named Veron attempted an experiment to raise submerged land using resonant frequencies, a plan to push water out through deep trenches and create artificial islands for expansion. But something went violently wrong. The archives suggest a sudden phase resonance inversion, a phenomenon so destructive that it created a chain of pressure implosions beneath the continental crust, triggering earthquakes and rapid coastal sinking. In this imaginative retelling, Atlantis died not by divine punishment or random natural disaster, but by hubris, scientists using tools they only partly understood.
Back in the modern world, Mara meets an elderly classical linguist named Dr. Kovacs, a man who spent decades translating tablets found near the Pillars of Hercules. He refuses to discuss Atlantean theories publicly, but behind closed doors, he reveals a personal archive of forbidden texts, including a medieval map with unmistakable grid patterns running through the Atlantic basin. Kovacs shows Mara a strange parchment filled with odd triangular symbols that match the carvings on her slate tablet. One symbol appears repeatedly, a circle inside a spiral, intersected by 9 radial lines, which Kovacs calls the seal of the listener. If you ever see this pattern in stone, he tells her, leave immediately. 2 days later, Kovacs is found unconscious in his home after what police call a probable break-in. Nothing is stolen except his private notebook filled with contact names and coordinates of submerged ruins. Mara grows paranoid. She starts receiving anonymous emails with subject lines like, "Stop the survey," and "The sea has secrets, better left alone." Meanwhile, James tries to distract himself by analyzing submersible video frame by frame until he notices something chilling. In several clips, a faint shimmering pattern appears in open water, not attached to stone or coral, almost like interference waves forming three-dimensional shapes. They look like architecture made of sound itself. They show outlines of arches and long corridors floating in water, there 1 second and gone the next. James wonders if they discovered a resonant hologram, a structure recorded not in material form, but in vibrating frequencies. That idea terrifies him, because if Atlantis recorded memories through resonance, then somewhere beneath the Atlantic floor might be entire libraries stored in sound, accessible only through the right frequency keys.
The story returns once more to the ancient era, following Selu, the archivist from Part 1, who fled into the resonant chamber during the collapse. Selu, in this fictional tale, preserved not just historical tablets, but a poetic record of her own memories. In one haunting account, she describes walking through a corridor filled with crystalline columns that emitted faint tones when someone approached them. She wrote, "Memory is not a story written in time, but a sound that echoes when a mind is ready to hear." Selu believed the resonance designed their archive so that knowledge could outlive material culture, knowing floods would erase cities, but sound could remain embedded in water and stone. Among her final entries is a cryptic line referencing the third migration, suggesting survivors from Atlantis reached the shores of North Africa and Iberia, and later carried fragments of their knowledge into Bronze Age tribes, influencing early navigation, stone construction, and star lore. As Part 2 continues, tension escalates. A mysterious sponsor offers Mara and James access to a deep-diving vessel capable of descending far below NOAA's restricted depth zones. The sponsor never gives a name, only a foundation title, Ocean Memory Initiative. When the pair arrive at a remote facility in Nova Scotia, they are handed legal agreements forbidding them from publishing any data without authorization. James hesitates, but Mara's obsession has taken hold. They join the dive. At 4,200 meters below sea level, floodlights illuminate a smooth vertical wall covered in spiral engravings identical to Mara's tablet. The water hums again, stronger this time, vibrating through the hull. Then, something happens that changes everything. The wall responds. Each vibration corresponds to one of the spirals, lighting up faintly, like a pulse traveling through stone. James panics, insisting they surface immediately, but Mara touches the viewing screen and whispers a sequence of tones she memorized from Kovacs' fragmentary translations. A low frequency booms through the water, and a section of the stone wall begins to shift. It isn't mechanical. It ripples like water, opening into a hollow chamber beyond. The final line of Part 2 describes what they see. A long corridor disappearing into darkness, filled with vertical columns of humming crystal, arranged in 9 perfect rows. And somewhere, deep in the submersible's audio feed, a voice, not a human voice, not clearly language, more like a tone forming syllables, seems to say, "We remembered you." The voice, if it was a voice at all, saturated the cabin like pressure in the ears, and James clutched his head, caught between disbelief and instinctive fear. Mara stared through the submersible viewport into the chamber, showing those 9 rows of humming crystal pillars. The frequency inside pulsed with a rhythm too precise to be random, something like a heartbeat measured in centuries rather than seconds. She began recording immediately, her hands trembling as she adjusted the hydrophones and spectrometer, but every standard reading came back as static, as if the instruments could register the vibrations without ever translating them into data. The Ocean Memory Initiative crew demanded they ascend, claiming hull integrity might be compromised. Yet Mara refused to leave until she saw one specific pillar at the far end of the chamber flicker bright blue, just for a moment. The dive supervisor later insisted the camera footage did not show that flicker, but Mara knew what she saw. Something inside the chamber reacted directly to her presence. After resurfacing, Mara and James were given 2 days of enforced rest at the facility, which felt less like recovery time and more like isolation. Uniformed personnel monitored every hallway, every lab door required biometric authorization, and a locked wing surrounded the dive footage servers. James wanted to walk away, but Mara was consumed by the suspicion that the chamber was waiting to be reopened. On the 3rd night, while James slept, she accessed Kovacs's recovered translations and recognized a pattern of tones corresponding to 9 bass frequencies. She believed those were keys, not musical scales, but activation codes.
The narrative shifts back to ancient Atlantis during the era of dissident scientists, focusing on the final hours before the cataclysm. The Circle of Nine held their last council meeting beneath the Great Harbor, a clandestine session attended only by the listener, Ilua, and the engineer Veyron. Ilua argued that resonance technology should not remain confined to the ruling elite, insisting all cities should hear the truth. Water levels were rising faster than anyone expected. But Veyron opposed her, claiming their experiments could reverse the floods if given more time. They were both partially right and disastrously wrong. The archives describe how the council voted 5-4 not to release the research publicly, a decision that would doom their civilization. Secret underground construction accelerated as resonance rushed to hide knowledge capable of surviving global collapse. Selu, the archivist in Part 2, recorded strange tremors shaking the city before the great fractures opened beneath the streets. She wrote that people felt the ground moving like a drum skin beaten from below. In the end, the catastrophe began not with water, but with sound, a resonance inversion that shattered sea walls, collapsed ports, and ignited subterranean gas vents. It was said that the first tower to fall was the listener's pillar, vanishing beneath a boiling sea in less than an hour. In fictional memory tablets, Selu described the sky turning copper as volcanic ash dimmed the sun. A legend suggests those who survived fled in 3 directions: west toward future Mesoamerica, east toward Iberia, and north toward the cold, where myths would mutate into bardic tales of drowned kingdoms.
Part 3 moves us back into the present, where Mara and James finally received clearance for a second deep dive, though nothing about it feels voluntary. The Ocean Memory Initiative executives watch their every move, their smiles tight, their language filled with coded phrases like asset control and continuity management. On the descent, the submersible passes through water denser than usual, as though invisible waves ripple across their path. When they reach the resonant chamber entrance again, something is changed. The opening is larger, as if the chamber expanded like lungs filling with breath. James feels panic rising, but Mara speaks the tone sequence she memorized: low, high, high, low, middle, low, and the pillars brighten in cascading responses. The hum intensifies into a near musical sound. Suddenly, the chamber projects images into the water, not sharp visuals, but shifting outlines like bioluminescent reflections. James sees what appears to be a hallway stretching deep into darkness, while Mara sees something stranger. A rotating map of symbols, spirals intersecting with celestial patterns. One symbol forms repeatedly, the seal of the listener, that Kovacs once warned her about. Mara whispers, "It's a key, or a warning." The hydrophones pick up faint pulses matching an ancient astronomical cycle tied to the rising of Sirius, the very star ancient Egyptians associated with floods. Then something in the upper corner of the feed shifts. A shape like a humanoid figure, formed of vibrating light, standing motionless, facing the submersible. Mara freezes. James tries to dismiss it as a glitch, but then the figure tilts its head, as if observing them.
In this fictional retelling, Mara believes they've encountered a stored consciousness, not a spirit, not a machine, but a memory encoded through resonance. This discovery changes everything because it suggests Atlantis did not just preserve knowledge, they preserved minds. The figure vanishes when a high-frequency pulse ripples through the chamber and the corridor ahead begins collapsing. The dive team loses control of the sub as debris whirls through the water. A voice over the intercom shouts to abort the dive. The chamber entrance seals as if reacting defensively. The sub makes an emergency ascent, barely escaping. Once aboard the ship, executives confiscate their equipment and isolate them for debriefing. Mara overhears fragments of conversation through a closing door. Unplanned access, containment protocol. James becomes convinced the Ocean Memory Initiative never intended to reveal anything to the public. They wanted to weaponize whatever they found. The final arc of Part 3 reveals Mara's hidden decision. She memorized part of the resonance sequence, every pitch and interval, knowing that tones cannot be confiscated like physical artifacts. At night, she hums them quietly, afraid and fascinated. The haunting final lines of Part 3 read, "Knowledge doesn't drown, it waits, and somewhere beneath 5 miles of ocean, a chamber of memory breathes in darkness, listening for the next voice that dares to speak."
2 weeks passed after the disastrous second dive, but neither Mara nor James slept normally again. They were released from the Ocean Memory Initiative facility under strict non-disclosure agreements, escorted by men who spoke with absolute neutrality, as if shepherding ghosts rather than scientists. Back in Boston, Mara moved into her grandfather's empty coastal house facing the Atlantic. For days she sat by the window, recording the tones she remembered, whispering them into an old reel-to-reel recorder, as if collecting fragments of a dream before waking erased it. James returned to his lab at the university, but he found his access restricted. Entire server drives had been wiped clean, remote backups mysteriously corrupted. Files related to the dive vanished from email archives and cloud storage without a trace. That erasure terrified him more than anything they witnessed underwater, because it meant someone with significant power wanted them forgotten. He began to research private oceanic intelligence networks, obscure naval advisory boards, retired offshore drilling executives, even rumored paramilitary salvage groups that specialize in deep containment. Meanwhile, Mara discovered something astonishing. When she played one of her recorded tones near a glass of salt water, ripple patterns appeared in concentric circles, matching the spiral design etched on her ancient tablet. The effect repeated, always forming 9 rings before dissolving. She began to wonder if the tone sequence had a physical effect on water structure. James, on the verge of panic, begged her to stop, but she insisted, saying, "Knowledge doesn't hide from fear, James. It hides from silence." The narrative returns to ancient Atlantis in the days following the resonance disaster. Surviving residents fled by night in carved obsidian boats lined with quartz, steering toward the edge of storms they believed carried protective currents. Legend says they carried 9 crystalline memory pillars, each containing voices of the listener's council. The fictional Blue Archive describes their final directive: protect the memory of water. They traveled along undersea fault lines, guided by star positions and deep sounds emitted by migrating whales. One tale recounts how the survivors reached a volcanic archipelago where shamans welcomed them as sea children and studied their resonant crystals, teaching them to store myths not on stone, but in song. Over centuries, Atlantean knowledge blended with indigenous ocean lore, spreading quietly across maritime cultures long before written alphabets emerged. Ancient navigators charted currents by listening at night to underwater hum that no one today can hear. Resonant scholars in this story believed that water held the oldest memory on Earth because it existed before continents formed, before mountains rose, before language evolved. They claimed water remembers sound more deeply than rock remembers fossils. Back in the modern timeline, Part 4 focuses on a new character, a journalist named Adrian Stone, a deep-dive investigative reporter who once exposed corruption in offshore energy contracts. He receives an anonymous package containing one of Mara's lost documents, a grainy freeze frame from the dive footage that shows the shimmering humanoid figure in the resonant chamber. The note attached simply reads, "Look for the listener." Adrian reaches out to Mara, who hesitates, but eventually meets him at a quiet restaurant near the harbor. She studies him carefully before speaking, lowering her voice whenever anyone walks near the table. She tells Adrian about Kovacs, Ocean Memory Initiative, the warning messages, and the pillars of humming crystal beneath the sea. Adrian doesn't fully believe her until she plays one tone on her recorder, and a water glass on the table trembles slightly, forming a faint spiral. He flinches, then leans closer, whispering, "Whatever you found, someone is willing to bury you for it." He agrees to help, but insists they need protection and data redundancy. He introduces them to a retired naval acoustic engineer, Captain Eleanor Barr, who spent 28 years running classified sonar operations in the Atlantic. Barr tells them something chilling. During her service, she overheard senior officers refer to harmonic black zones, areas of ocean where submarine communication systems fail for unknown reasons. She shows them navigational charts with 9 such zones marked, each corresponding to possible ancient Atlantean chamber sites. There's a network down there. Not one chamber, many.
Part 4 escalates the mystery and danger. Mara begins analyzing the 9 sites on Eleanor's map and notices something remarkable. They form a geometric shape resembling a 9-pointed star, exactly like the seal of the listener. James reluctantly agrees to join another expedition despite feeling betrayed by his own fear. Adrian arranges discreet funding through a maritime documentary front, claiming they are filming lost shipwreck cultures. They rent a small research vessel, the Calypso Meridian, equipped with a makeshift resonance scanner built from modified hydrophones. When they reach the first black zone, the scanner picks up deep pulses beneath the boat, slower than a heartbeat but steady, almost like a ticking clock counting down through the water. Mara hums one tone into a hydrophone input, and the signal changes instantly, shifting pitch in response. James stares at her, eyes wide, whispering, "It's talking back." Then something happens that no one on board can explain. The boat's metal hull begins vibrating at low amplitude, enough to set loose objects rattling, not violently, but rhythmically, perfectly in time with the tone sequence. Adrian records everything, but the audio later corrupts into static. Eleanor, hearing the vibrations, steps toward the deck railing and freezes. Out at sea, directly beneath the moon, faint lines of bioluminescence appear in the dark water, tracing a pattern. A 9-pointed star, glowing blue before fading into black. The final sections of Part 4 push toward revelation and impending catastrophe. Mara deciphers a cryptic phrase from Silu's Blue Archive. Memory chooses the listener, not the seeker.
She realizes that the resonant chambers aren't just passively storing knowledge, they're programmed to respond only to certain minds, perhaps chosen by frequency compatibility rather than lineage or training. She fears what might happen if the wrong organization, one seeking control rather than understanding, activated the full network. Meanwhile, an unmarked vessel appears on radar, closing in fast. Eleanor orders the crew to kill the lights and cut the engines. They float in silence, listening to the ocean breathe. The unknown vessel passes slowly, scanning with low-frequency sonar pulses that thrum through their bones. Mara hums one tone into a hydrophone input, and the signal changes instantly, shifting pitch in response. James stares at her, eyes wide, whispering, "It's talking back." Then something happens that no one on board can explain. The boat's metal hull begins vibrating at low amplitude, enough to set loose objects rattling, not violently, but rhythmically, perfectly in time with the tone sequence. The chapter ends with the group making one last choice, to dive at dawn into the second resonant chamber site, using a portable submersible Adrian acquired through clandestine channels. The closing sentence of Part 4 reads, "Beneath a rising sun and a restless tide, 9 voices of memory waited in darkness, ready to answer anyone, brave or foolish enough to speak the first tone."
The diver was losing daylight, and the water around him was getting darker. His oxygen gauge blinked a warning, but he wasn't ready to ascend. Something deep inside him whispered that he was close, dangerously close, to a discovery that would either validate everything he believed or drown him in silence forever. He forced himself lower, pushing past the jagged edges of what looked like carved stone, and just when he was about to turn back, his flashlight caught something impossible. A straight, perfectly symmetrical corridor, cut cleanly into the seabed, as if a doorway had been carved thousands of feet beneath the ocean. Mason later told almost no one what happened next, because even he couldn't believe it was real, and because the tiny number of people he did tell warned him never to repeat it. But that corridor, he said, wasn't natural. It was a tunnel, and there were markings on the wall, symbols, repeating geometric shapes forming patterns that looked eerily similar to Sumerian cuneiform mixed with Mayan iconography. According to his dive logs, he tried to video record them, but the moment he powered on the camera, it shut down instantly, like something was scrambling electronics. His own dive light began to flicker. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to rise, and finally he obeyed, kicking desperately upward through the thickening waves. When he breached the surface, gasping, the first thing he noticed was the silence around him. The sea was still. No gulls, no wind, just a wide and unnatural quiet that made his skin crawl.
When he returned to land, he contacted a researcher named Dr. Adria Laurent, a linguist who had spent decades studying anomalous inscriptions from undersea ruins found near Malta, Bimini, and the Canary Islands. When Mason described the symbols, Adria didn't laugh, didn't argue, didn't doubt. She went pale. She told him he needed to come to her lab immediately. Adria showed Mason an unpublished photograph unofficially circulated within a tiny network of independent archaeologists. It was a coral-encrusted slab recovered from a fishing trawler in 1998. Across its surface were the same shapes Mason saw: interlocking diamonds with vertical ticks and a swirling 3-line motif found in distant ancient cultures everywhere from Göbekli Tepe in Turkey to Chavin in Peru. "It's a migration pattern," Adria whispered. "Not migration of people, migration of ideas or knowledge." What Adria proposed was breathtaking, that Atlantis wasn't a city, but a civilization that moved, a network, a culture whose foundations spread outward like the roots of a tree, teaching and upgrading the early civilizations that came after. That might explain why advanced stonework appears suddenly in ancient records, why some cultures worldwide leaped forward from primitive tools to precision-cut megaliths seemingly overnight. Critics argue these coincidences are just parallel evolution, but others point out how improbably identical some building techniques are across civilizations that, according to conventional history, never made contact. Mason and Adria weren't the first to notice. Reports from early naval intelligence files during World War II mention unexplained sonar readings in the Atlantic, entire plateaus of unnatural consistency, long ridges forming 90-degree angles, and echo shadows resembling subterranean chambers. One declassified memo even references what analysts dubbed the canary grids, a repeated rectangular pattern appearing under ocean sediment west of Morocco. Some experts dismissed these claims as technical errors, but others quietly noted how suspicious it was that after 1954, almost all large-scale Atlantic cartography projects were suddenly classified. We will likely never know how much has been mapped beneath the ocean, because oceanography funding from defense sources rarely becomes public information. Yet strangely, civilian divers keep accidentally finding things that shouldn't exist. Adria pressed Mason with one more idea, one that terrified him. "Advanced doesn't always mean futuristic," she said. "It might mean forgotten." She believed the Atlanteans could have been masters of a natural technology, stone resonance, sound levitation, geothermal energy wiring through crystalline ore, a form of engineering that left almost no metal debris detectable to modern instruments. If a civilization collapsed that relied on sound-based architecture instead of iron or steel, its remains would appear to us today as just rock. We might already be looking at Atlantis every day and dismissing it as geology. According to this theory, Atlantis didn't vanish in a moment of mythical destruction. It eroded, was buried, and now hides behind classifications like natural rock formations. Adria and Mason planned a second dive, but this time with equipment shielded from electromagnetic interference. They wanted to capture the corridor on film. Mason swore that he would return to that doorway. Whether it was a floodgate, an entrance to an ancient vault, or just an illusion caused by shifting sand, he needed answers. And Adria, driven by patterns in ancient symbols, believed that if Atlantis truly existed, the lost city was just one node in a global network of extinct knowledge hubs. The story would soon take a darker turn, because anything that hints at rewriting world history attracts attention, not always from scientists, but sometimes from forces that prefer secrets to stay buried. And as Mason would soon learn, some discoveries don't get published. They disappear.